Hey, Chapter 6. It stayed wicked cold all through Christmas vacation, 10 or 12 below zero every morning, and when it warmed up to zero or so in the afternoon, it snowed. Joseph and I shoveled by the house and the barns and shoveled and shoveled and shoveled, and we had to throw the snow higher and higher to make it over the drifts. Every day after Christmas, it was more snow, and when we went outside on the first day of the new year, again, we had 4 or 5 new inches to shovel off the paths, except this time, when we were almost done and I was throwing one last full load, I suddenly felt a shovelful scatter across my back, and when I turned around, another shovelful across my chest and in my face, and Joseph was smiling and laughing. Joseph was smiling and laughing. Number 6, not even sort of. So what do? I pulled a shovelful from the drift and threw it at him, and missed. So another shovelful, and I chased him until we got almost to the big barn. He was laughing so hard he was doubled over, and I threw it onto his back. And then, of course, he had to get another shovelful, and I had to get one, and you can figure out the rest. We spent a long time shoveling out in front of the house and barns again. The cows were annoyed when we came in a little late for milking. Dahlia stepped on my foot, and when cows do that, they mean to. But it was the first time Joseph had played and laughed. It was worth an annoyed cow. Supper was fine that night. Chicken, carrots, and sweet potatoes, bread pudding with homemade vanilla ice cream, and homemade chocolate sauce. We were all laughing about the snow. We were all laughing about the snow and how it was coming down again and how there would be a lot more shoveling tomorrow and maybe we'd have to do it twice again. Joseph had played. Then the phone rang and immediately everything stopped. Since Christmas, my parents had been waiting for the call about Jupiter. Joseph, too. He stood frozen. His chair fell back and he bent down to pick it up, but he looked at my mother the whole time and she looked at him. She got up and she answered the phone. It wasn't Mrs. Stroud, and it wasn't about Jupiter. It was Joseph's father. Hello, Mr. Brooks, said my mother. Joseph backed up against the wall. My mother listened for a long time. She wasn't listening happily. I don't think that's possible, she said. She listened again for a long time. Has Mrs. Stroud been informed? We won't allow this unless... More listening. All right, she said. Not before 4 o'clock. Yes, 4 o'clock. More listening. All right, she said. If that's what's been decided, yes, he's right here. I suppose you can talk to him. She looked at Joseph and held the phone out. He came away from the wall and took it. Yeah, he said. My mother sat down on the table. Joseph's father has hired a lawyer, she said. Okay, said Joseph. He's somehow gotten visitation rights. I don't know how since... She looked at me and stopped. Anyway, he says he'll be here on Monday to see Joseph. We'll need to talk to Mrs. Stroud first, said my father. Okay, said Joseph. You bet we will, said my mother. I'm okay, said Joseph. No, said Joseph. Okay, said Joseph. Okay. He hung up the phone and sat down. You all right, my father said. Joseph nodded. Joseph, you want to... Joseph stood up. I'm going to check on Rosie one more time, he said. I don't remember if I filled her hay bin. We did, I said. I'm just going to go check, said Joseph. He went down the hall. When he opened the back door, a cold wind blew in. That cold wind stayed with us as we waited for Joseph to come back inside. And even after he did, it stayed with us the rest of that night. And it stayed with us the rest of Christmas vacation. Joseph didn't play anymore. We didn't talk about his father coming, but it was like that feeling you have in dreams when something is on its way and there's nothing you can do about it except to hope you wake up before it comes. Sometimes you do. Joseph was waiting for me after school on Monday. It was a blue day, a few high clouds, somewhere in the low teens, almost like a thaw. Joseph said he was going to walk home, and I said I'd walk with him, and he didn't say I was being a jerk. He hunched his coat together and he started off. When the bus passed, Ernie Hupfer, John Wall, and Danny Nations and his earbuds were watching out their windows, and Ernie Hupfer was shaking his head, like I was really being a jerk. We stopped at Old First Congregational Church and threw snowballs up at the bell. It didn't sound the same as a good clank with a rock, but Joseph wanted to throw a bunch up there, and we did. Then we walked out to the Alliance Bridge and threw snowballs into the river through the broken slats. And then Joseph said it was getting colder, and I said I was still okay, but he said we'd better go. And we did. We got home a little after 4 o'clock. A van was parked in the driveway. Brook Plumbing, it read on the side. And a car, State of Maine, Department of Health and Human Services, it read on the side. We went into the house, me first. My parents are there, standing, and Mrs. Stroud standing, and Joseph's father sitting. "Hey, Stud," he said. "Hey," said Joseph. Joseph looked down at the floor as he walked across the kitchen and laid his backpack on the counter. "It takes a lawyer to see my own son," said Mr. Brooke, "but I finally got one, a good one." "Okay," said Joseph. Mr. Brooke stood up. "Let's go talk," he said. Joseph nodded. "The living room's free," said my father. He pointed right in there. "I'm taking my son for a drive," said Mr. Brooke. "Nope," said Mrs. Stroud. "You'll stay here in the house." "Like hell I will." Mrs. Stroud took out her phone and began hitting numbers. "I'm about to end this visit right now, Mr. Brooke. Your choice." She held her finger over the last number and looked at him. Mr. Brooke looked back at Mrs. Stroud and then walked over to Joseph and put his hand on Joseph's back and shoved him a little toward the living room. You know what happened when Mr. Brooke put his hand on Joseph's back? Joseph flinched. But he went into the living room with his father anyway. Mrs. Stroud put her phone back in her purse. "I'm sorry about this," she said. "I'm really very sorry. I advised against it, but he's right. He's got a good lawyer." "Well, not a good lawyer. A persistent and threatening lawyer. And unfortunately, those are the ones who get exactly what they want." "What does he want?" said my father. Mrs. Stroud shook her head. "I think it's money." "He's here for money?" "He's complicating any adoption for Jupiter," said Mrs. Stroud. "His lawyer claims that since Joseph is a minor, he had no parental rights to sign away. His father, his legal guardian, has those rights, and it seems that Mr. Brooke won't sign away anything until a large check arrives at his house with Madeline's parents' signature on it. Of course, there's nothing in writing that says this, but everyone knows what he's waiting for." My father stood up. "So, Joseph, Mr. Brooke's lawyer is thinking ahead. He wants to be able to demonstrate Mr. Brooke's strong parental affection for his son and, by extension, his granddaughter. And the girl, her adoption's in limbo. Madeline's parents want to move on, and they want Jupiter adopted into a good home. But until Mr. Brooke signs or stops his delays, that can't happen. No family will choose a child whose adoption might be contested." Joseph's voice doesn't count? "He's a minor," said Mrs. Stroud. My father and mother looked at each other. Then they looked toward the living room where we could hear mostly Mr. Brooke's voice. "Jack," said my father, "maybe you'd better get started on the milking. I'm not sure if Joseph is going to be—" "Okay," I said. It was warmer in the big barn, and the smell of hay and old wood and leather and cow like always. I walked past Rosie and she looked up, then back down. I guess she was disappointed I wasn't Joseph. So I started with Dahlia and I leaned into her and listened to the rhythm of the milk into the pail. No matter what's going on, there's something good about the rhythm of streaming milk and this warm smell of it, and Dahlia's mooing and the sounds of her chewing. Except it isn't good when you're about to finish, and then you hear Mr. Brooke's voice again from inside your house all the way across the yard. More annoyed than Dahlia ever thought to be. I poured the milk into the cooler and went in. No one looked up when I opened the door. They were all pretty much eyeball to eyeball with each other. Joseph was standing with his back against the wall. "A father's got rights to his own son, you know," said Mr. Brooke. "Who do you think you are keeping him away from me?" said Mr. Brooke. "Now I've got a lawyer too," said Mr. Brooke. "You think I'm going to give in to someone just because they're rich?" said Mr. Brooke. Mrs. Stroud said, "If you don't leave immediately, I'll—" Mr. Brooke came closer to my father. "And who do you think you're kidding? You know you've got a sweet deal going. You get your check from the state every month to keep my kid. You're in this for the money." He pointed to Joseph. "Does he know that?" He turned to Joseph. "You know you're just a job for them. You're nothing but income." My father walked across the kitchen to the desk in the hallway. He opened a drawer and pulled out some papers, and he brought them in and stood next to Joseph. "Joseph," he said, "your father's right. Every month a check comes from the state. I want you to see where it goes." He held out the papers. "This is a printout from the bank. It shows checks being put into an account every month starting here, the first month you came to us. You see? And here's the balance in the account. Every single one of the checks added up together. You see that too?" Joseph nodded. "Now look here. You see your name? The account is in your name. That money is yours. We haven't taken a dime. It's for you." "It's the beginning of your college fund, Joseph," said my mother. Joseph took the printout and stared at it. "College fund," said Mr. Brooke. "You think Joe's going to college? Like he's going to Harvard College and strut around like he's all smart and everything? Smarter than his dad? You think that's what's going to happen?" "Yes," said my mother. "That's exactly what's going to happen. And Joseph is going to go to college. And if you asked any of his teachers, they'd say so too. Mr. Brooke laughed. Then they don't know what for. But I do. I'm telling you, the day's not far off when I come back here to take my son away. Like I said, a father's got rights. We'll see, said Mrs. Stroud. We'll see, said Mr. Brooke. Then he looked at me, pointed, and turned back to my parents. How'd you like it if someone came to take your boy away, huh? How would you like it? I bet you'd do whatever it took to get him back. I bet you would. Mr. Brooke laughed again and then walked over to me and took me by my shoulder. Don't touch him, said Joseph quickly. Mr. Brooke's hand was hard and heavy and it squeezed my shoulder bone. My father was coming across the room just as he lifted it. He laughed. See what I mean, he said. My father stood very close to him. Mrs. Stroud took out her phone again. Mr. Brooke turned back to Joseph. I'll get you out of here as quick as I can. Then things will be better, I promise. It will be a whole new life for us both, and you won't have to go to college for it. He found his coat on the rack and opened the door. And Joe, he said, next time, you try to tell me not to do something. He didn't finish, but he left. It got a whole lot colder in the kitchen than in the big barn with the cows, and quieter. I guess I'd better go back to my milking, I said. Joseph walked across the kitchen. He found his coat too, and we went out together. He didn't talk at all. When Rosie heard us, she turned her head back in her happy moo, and waggled her rump to tell Joseph she loved him. Cows can be like that when you need them to be. Not always, but sometimes. And maybe Rosie knew Joseph needed her to be like that right then. So she mooed her happy moo again. And Joseph rubbed her rump, and he settled the pail beneath her and leaned against her side, and he began to milk, slow and sure, the way he did. He didn't talk the whole time, except to Rosie. He didn't talk at supper until dessert, and when in the middle of the quiet he looked at my mother and said, Am I really going to college? My mother passed him another bowl of her canned peaches. I think Mr. Delaney and Mrs. Holloway would have our heads if you didn't go to college, Joseph, she said. Joseph smiled, sort of. I think it was the 7th time. The next day the cold broke. It wouldn't last long, my father predicted, maybe a few days. The sun was out and the sky too bright a blue. To look at the snow melted off the yews and came clumping down. The cows were as restless as spring, thinking there might be grass out in the fields, even though the snow was still pretty deep. And Quintus Sertorius would not stay in his stall, so after school Joseph and I took him out to the paddock to let him walk around. He plowed through the snow way past his knees, with both Joseph and I riding him, Joseph's first time on a horse and bareback to boot. And Quintus Sertorius snorted and nickered and switched his tail high and did everything he could to tell us how happy he was that spring was coming, even though it was still a long way off. Sometimes it's like that. You know something good is coming, and even though it's not even close yet, still, just know it's coming enough to make you snort and nicker, sort of. I think just knowing my parents were going to help Joseph made me believe something good was coming, even if his father had a good lawyer and rights. My parents would help Joseph see Jupiter, and someday Joseph would go to college. But the days dragged on, and they grew heavy with snow again. The days dragged on, and they grew heavy with cold again. The days dragged on, and they grew heavy with waiting. My parents called Joseph's counselor twice, then 3 times, and she said she would like a few weeks to evaluate Joseph before she made the decision about him seeing Jupiter. When my parents called Mrs. Stroud, she said she would have to meet with Joseph's counselor first and get her opinion. And when my mother said that they had been trying to get his counselor to give her opinion, Mrs. Stroud said her hands were tied and we would have to be patient. When my parents called Joseph's teachers and asked them to write letters about Joseph's progress in their classes, Mr. DeOlney and Mrs. Calloway and Coach Sweetic all wrote letters right away. But Mrs. Stroud said they would have to be assembled into a file and presented to someone else in the Department of Health and Human Services. And that someone was also very, very busy, and it might be some time before he could make a decision. Mrs. Stroud tried to explain this one afternoon to Joseph in our kitchen with my parents. I was out in the barn milking, of course, but when Joseph came into the big barn, I could pretty much tell that Mrs. Stroud had told him. Did she say when you can see Jupiter? I said. Waited a long time. He set the bucket beneath Rosie. Nope, said Joseph finally. Did she say how long until they decide? Nope, said Joseph. Waited another long time. I finished Dahlia off. Did she say anything, I said. Jupiter's in Brunswick, Joseph said. Brunswick? Yeah. He got to work on Rosie. Brunswick is south of here, right? He said. Joseph, you're not south, right? Yeah, but you can't. Jackie, let's just shut up for now, okay? Okay, I said. Okay, he said. I poured the milk into the cooler. It's Jack, I said. Yeah, said Joseph. Then we shut up, both of us. We didn't talk at supper or through homework that night. We didn't talk when I went to bed and Joseph stood in the cold dark watching for Jupiter. Or at breakfast, or on the bus, or in any of our classes. We didn't talk at all. And I don't think Joseph talked to anyone else either. At the end of the day, when I was out to meet him by the school bus and he wasn't there, I figured he was walking home so he didn't have to talk. I got on the bus and watched him for the whole way, past the turn by the old First Congregational, past the Alliance Bridge, all along the frozen Alliance. I never saw him. When I got home, he wasn't there. Where's Joseph, my mother said. I think he might be walking, I said. She suddenly looked very worried. I suppose that's it, she said. But she went out to the road to watch for him, and then after a few minutes she went to the barn to find my father. At milking time, Joseph still wasn't home. I guess I'll ride into town, said my father. Jack, you get started. I'm sure Joseph will be along. He wasn't, and an hour later my father drove back. My mother was waiting at the door. They went up to our room. Some of Joseph's clothes were missing. And Walden. The second volume of Octavian Nothing. He must have stuffed them all in his backpack that morning. I think I'd better call Mrs. Stroud, said my mother, and she went downstairs. Jack, said my father, you done with the milking? I nodded. Rosie, too? I nodded. He looked up at the sky, where snow clouds were lowering down like granite slabs. Then let's you and me get in the pickup. We'll see if we can find him. And I said, I think I know where he's going. My father looked at me. He's going to find Jupiter, I said. He nodded. Go tell your mother we'll be late for supper. Chapter 7. We weren't more than 10 minutes out of Easton before it began to snow, and not just a little. The snow came down with hard gusts, socking the sides of the pickup and blotting out the windshield. The sound of the wind was awful, like it was crying and scared and lost and not sure what to do except but wail, which is sort of what I thought Joseph would be right now, out in the middle of it, except he would never in a million years wail. We looked out the sides of the road, hoping we'd see Joseph trying to hitch, but now it was so dark, and the snow was so hard, and the road's already getting bad, I don't think either of us had much hope. He's probably found a place to stay, said my father. I'm not sure he believed it, but what else could we believe? Unless we believed Jay Perkins was out in a snowmobile with Brian Boss and Nick Porter and they found Joseph, but neither of us said that. The snow got thicker and thicker. In 45 minutes outside of Easton, we turned around. We hadn't gotten very far, but we weren't going to get much farther in this. Okay, so I was crying on my way back. My father rubbing my shoulder. Maybe he was crying too. At home, my mother fussed with late supper. Pancakes, since they were easy to keep warm. She had already called Mrs. Stroud. Mrs. Stroud had already called the police, who I guess had already called Easton Middle, as if Joseph might be hiding out in the janitor's closet or something. So, of course, Mr. Canton had already come by, so full of himself, my mother said, all about how he knew something like this would happen, and the kids who come from Stone Mountain are bound to run off, and it's not our fault. It's just that that's who Joseph Brooke is. My mother said, I thought I was going to take the skillet to his face. She was holding the skillet high over her shoulder, holding it with both hands when she said this. My mother, I should tell you, is a pacifist. She got arrested 3 times during college for protesting foreign policy in El Salvador. She got arrested 5 times for protesting against nuclear power, so she doesn't like pushy policemen very much or pushy vice principals, and probably Mr. Canton was in more danger of a flattened face than he understood. We waited for a phone call and listened to the storm, and waited for a phone call and listened to the storm. Mugs of hot coffee and hot chocolate. My parents talking about what they should have done, how they should have known, wondering where Joseph had found shelter, wondering if someone had picked him up, if he was okay, if he was lost. My parents never asked about my homework. I could have done it anyway. Later than usual, I went upstairs. The room was as cold as it has ever been. The wood floor was freezing, but for a while in the dark, I wrapped my arms around myself and stood by the desk and looked out the window for Jupiter. In the storm, I couldn't see a thing. Joseph wouldn't be able to either. And I wondered if Joseph knew that what he wanted, he couldn't have. Madeline, Jupiter. I wonder if he knew it couldn't be. Maybe he didn't want to know it couldn't be. So he was out somewhere in the snow, heading to Brunswick, when it was already too late, which was he probably already knew, but he was going to Brunswick anyway. Things go through your mind when you're standing in the cold and the dark, watching the snow with your feet freezing on the wooden floor. They do.